Thank you for inviting me to speak here today. My presentation is going to be about human rights impact assessments and how to prepare for them. Just before we get into it, I just wanted to say a few words on the Danish Institute for Human Rights, where I work. The Danish Institute for Human Rights is Denmark's national human rights institution. We're mandated to work domestically in accordance with the UN Paris principles on national human rights institutions to monitor human rights implementation within the Danish context and to also inform and educate on human rights to promote human rights enjoyment within Denmark. But then we also have an international mandate to work both with business and private sector actors more in an advisory capacity to support human rights. And we have a unit specifically focusing on business and human rights, which was established in the late 90s, focusing within this strategy period specifically on technology and human rights as a focus area. That includes both the business and human rights related work, but also work that we are doing within the international area with other national human rights institutions in a development context. And as mentioned, I am a senior advisor with the Human Rights and Business Department, managing our Responsible Value Chains program, where our work around technology, business, and human rights is located. So just to set the scene for my presentation on human rights impact assessment, on artificial intelligence, I wanted to just give a quick introduction to the UN framework on business and human rights, including the guiding principles on business and human rights. So the guiding principles on business and human rights are a set of principles which have been unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council of the UN, which highlight the role of businesses in respecting human rights, recognizing that they can and do cause negative human rights impacts across their operations, as well as the role of the state in providing a regulatory framework that enables business respect for human rights and that holds companies accountable for their negative human rights impacts. And it dictates responsibilities that of businesses that refer to international human rights standards. So in a way, irrespective of national legislation, of course, also highlighting the role and need for the state to implement laws to protect against corporate-related human rights abuses. As mentioned, it centers around these three pillars, focusing both on the state responsibility to protect human rights, of course, in the context of AI, as we've heard about. This is about putting in place laws, policies, regulations to ensure some type of regulation of the behavior of business actors involved in the development and implementation of artificial intelligence technologies, and also to provide information and capacity for companies to better understand and address their human rights impacts. Then the second pillar is focusing on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And as mentioned before, this is focusing more on companies having in place processes to identify, assess, and address their human rights impacts through a process of human rights impact assessment, which is also termed as human rights due diligence. And then finally, focusing on access to remedy where the negative impacts occur, and that includes both principles around the state putting in place regulation to ensure access to remedy for those who may be negatively impacted by business behavior, as well as companies themselves putting in place structures to receive and manage complaints on negative human rights impacts and abuses. When it comes specifically to business responsibilities, they require, the UN Guiding Principles require companies to put in place policy commitment, a due diligence process, as mentioned before, which includes the process of identifying, assessing, and addressing human rights impacts, both the ones that companies may cause directly through their operations that they contribute to or are linked to. And of course, in the context of artificial intelligence, those distinctions are quite important because we can see both the companies that are developing artificial intelligence technologies being both, directly causing impacts, but we can also see them as being linked to the impacts by the way in which their technology is being utilized by other actors once sold and applied by those. And then finally, as mentioned before, access to remedy as a requirement to businesses as well. As mentioned before, the reference point is really all human rights, but of course most centrally the International Bill of Human Rights. It focuses on all affected stakeholders with a specific focus on vulnerable groups. So now I've told you a little bit about the broader framework on business and human rights. What does that mean when it comes to digital ecosystems? And of course, we're all aware of the positive impacts that technologies can have on human rights and on society, and simply be harmless. But there are also a lot of ways which we've heard about during the past couple of days, and in the most recent intervention that technology can be used for human rights harms. And of course, there are many different ways that digital technologies can impact human rights. We are all aware of, and most likely aware of, the various cases where we've seen negative human rights impacts associated with the use and deployment of technology, including artificial intelligence technology. These are some of the cases highlighted here. And of course, this has helped to highlight and recognize the need for some type of framework to deal with these negative impacts. So we've seen developments both from within the UN system, where there have been specific moves towards applying the UN guiding principles to digital technology, specifically through a project within the UNCHR focusing on business and technology, specifically in the context of human rights impacts. There are the developments that we have heard about during the past couple of days at the EU level around creating certain fundamental rights impact assessments of artificial intelligence systems. And then finally, there are the various special rapporteurs and treaty bodies who have highlighted the need for better identification and assessment of human rights impacts of technology, including artificial intelligence technologies. And there are many different types of ways that digital activities impact on human rights. I won't linger too much on this because we've already heard from the speakers on some of the challenges that have occurred, specifically in the most recent presentation on equality and non-discrimination in the deployment and use of AI. But of course, there are also issues around the right to privacy, freedom of expression as it relates to the deployment of digital technologies. And of course, understanding the different human rights impacts and how they're interlinked, but there are also a lot of challenges related to how do you then conduct human rights due diligence of digital technologies. the UN framework on business and human rights came at a time where there was a lot of emphasis on companies that had a very clear physical footprint, so within the extractive sector or within the agricultural sector, etc. That's also why the UN has decided to establish a specific project focusing on technology and human rights in business, because there are a number of key challenges that are quite unique to the technology sector as compared to other sectors when it comes to how to conduct human rights due diligence. One of these is the lack of geographic boundaries. So basically, artificial intelligence systems, software, other digital solutions can potentially be used anywhere, and the way in which they're used and the impacts that has can vary greatly across different contexts. So there is really a challenge of actually understanding the context and anticipating the ways in which the technology will impact on human rights, given different contexts, different sensitivities, considerations at the local level. A second challenge is stakeholder engagement. So if you have a technology that can potentially be applied in many different contexts, it can be very difficult to identify, well, based on the local context issues, who will be the ones who may be impacted by the use of the technology. It's easy enough to identify potential users and include them in your stakeholders, but what about the ones who are impacted, who aren't the users, but impacted by the way in which the technology is utilized. So the key questions are here, how can we identify the rights holders and stakeholders in the first place? How do we engage with them? Do they even have the capacity to engage, etc. Yeah, and as mentioned before, really, who are the rights holders? What is the difference from the end user of the technology? And who are the vulnerable rights holders in that context? And then finally, the assessment triggers or timing for conducting assessments of the potential human rights impacts of technology. And that is, very different from what we have maybe seen more in the traditional human rights impact assessments conducted on a more physical type of business activities such as extractives and agriculture. So here, we have a clear project site, but with technology, we have an ongoing development and an ongoing application, which can play out, as mentioned before, very differently depending on the context. There's also certain processes that happen within the traditional extractives, agricultural kind of large infrastructure projects where you would normally have a permitting stage, you would have some licensing processes, etc. With digital activities, as such, there's no permit on application in a specific context, no requirements as it relates to that. There's also, in the context of large infrastructure projects, long planning time, and in, of course, the technology space, you're dealing with very high-speed, iterative processes for developing the technology. And then you also have, within the large infrastructure projects, a lot of experiences from past projects. Of course, we're seeing a lot of cases coming out on the negative impacts of artificial intelligence technologies, but there's constant innovation, and sometimes we're talking about completely new projects where the potential impacts as they play out in different contexts are not yet identified. So how does this all lead me to the topic of human rights impact assessment of digital technologies? Well, now I've outlined some of the different challenges, issues that we're facing. And just to say that the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we've been working with the topic of human rights impact assessment for a long time. We've been engaging directly with business since we were established as a department, and been conducting human rights impact assessments, more focusing on those, very land-intensive, traditional kind of sectors, extractives, agriculture, for over a decade. And based on that, we developed a guidance and toolbox focusing specifically on how do you conduct human rights impact assessment, both in terms of process and content, taking a human rights-based approach and taking international human rights into consideration. And that has, received high recognition, including from the International Association of Impact Assessors. And we've also looked specifically at how can we work with the broader impact assessment space, so environmental, social, health impact assessments, to better integrate human rights considerations into such processes. But we were really challenged when looking at technology for all of the reasons that I mentioned before, because we wanted to actually see if we could develop a guidance on human rights impact assessment for digital activities. And when we started out, we thought, okay, maybe it would be possible to tweak certain elements or include certain elements to the existing toolbox to capture digital activities. But what we identified was that that was simply not possible, given all of the challenges that I outlined before. So we decided to instead go back to the drawing board in some sense, to understand, what are digital business activities, how do they impact human rights, and how can we use some of the existing tools that we have through the work that we've done on human rights impact assessment of larger infrastructure projects and apply that to the context of digital activities. And we did so in consultation with various stakeholders, both businesses, civil society, academia, and organized a physical roundtable where we really tried to unpack the different stages of a human rights impact assessment and what are the particular challenges, issues when we're dealing with digital activities. Because there was this stated need, as I outlined in the beginning, from very many different sides of some kind of guidance. What are the expectations, demands on good human rights impact assessment when it comes to technology? And one of the key areas that we identified, of course, based also on the limitations that I mentioned before, was a need to emphasize stakeholder engagement and the context of analysis on the digital business activities. So briefly on human rights impact assessment, what it is. It is a methodology for how to identify and assess human rights impacts, as well as a process through which to do that. So it includes both considerations around planning and scoping of the assessment, collecting the data, doing the situational context analysis, analyzing the impacts identified, what to put in place to do impact prevention, mitigation, and remediation, and then finally reporting, monitoring, and evaluation. And stakeholder engagement is, of course, central to all of these different stages of the impact assessment process. The human rights impact assessment is a key tool for human rights due diligence of business in contexts where you do see severe potential or actual human rights impacts. And the ones who can use the toolbox, the guidance that we've created, are both companies who are interested in better understanding the human rights impacts of their digital activities, as well as other actors that may want companies to conduct human rights impact assessments or are monitoring, reviewing impact assessments performed, because the aim is also to create a certain level or standard of expected practice on human rights impact assessment for it to be truly meaningful. And to support that, we have developed a set of key criteria for human rights impact assessment, covering both the process and the content for human rights impact assessments. So as mentioned before, when it comes to the process of human rights impact assessment, of course, we're talking about assessments of human rights impacts. So it's important that that assessment also takes a human rights-based approach, including considerations around participation of various stakeholders, non-discrimination and involvement of different stakeholders, empowerment of stakeholders to engage on the impact assessment, transparency around the results and the process, as well as clear understanding of accountability and who's responsible for actual follow-up on the impact assessment findings. And then it also includes specific criteria on the content, of course, using international human rights as the benchmark, looking at the scope of impacts as it relates to human rights and the impacts to human rights, looking at the severity of the impacts to human rights enjoyment, and of course also, as mentioned, quite centrally, access to remedy where severe negative human rights impacts have occurred. So as mentioned before, the impact assessment guidance that we've developed for digital technologies can be used by companies, including artificial intelligence developers, to build more rights respecting artificial intelligence solutions. It can be used by states to improve the practices of suppliers. So when they procure artificial intelligence related technologies for their use, as well as in setting, hopefully, certain standards around the expected conduct and processes for business actors to assess and address their human rights impacts. And then finally, it can be used by others, by national human rights institutions and my sister institutions for monitoring. It can be used to build internal capacity of companies, civil society, others on various human rights impacts that relate to technology and how they can get involved. So yeah, these are some of the various ways in which it can be used. And I've included here a few links to both the guidance on the human rights impact assessment of digital activities, as well as some other publications that we have been involved in around investor expectations to tech developments, as well as the role of the tech sector in national action plans on business and human rights. So with that, I stop my presentation.